Everything changed the afternoon I left the cancer center in Nashville. The doctor had spent nearly an hour going over scans, test results, and treatment options, but by the time I reached the parking lot, I couldn't remember half of what he'd said. I just sat behind the wheel of my truck staring through the windshield. People walked past carrying coffee cups, talking on phones, living ordinary Tuesdays. Mine had just stopped being ordinary. For almost 20 minutes, I couldn't bring myself to start the engine. The diagnosis wasn't a possibility anymore. It wasn't something we were waiting to confirm. It was real. The drive home felt disconnected from reality, like I was watching someone else's life through glass. Traffic moved. Radio stations changed. Miles disappeared beneath the tires. When I turned onto my street, something immediately caught my attention. A black SUV sat parked in front of my house. I didn't recognize it. At first, I told myself it belonged to a neighbor, maybe a contractor, maybe a visitor. But when I pulled into my driveway, the vehicle remained exactly where it was. I walked to the front door carrying the weight of news I hadn't even figured out how to tell my wife. The house was unlocked. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard laughter upstairs. Not a television, not a podcast. Two voices. A woman's laugh, and a man's. I froze in the entryway, one hand still resting on the doorknob. For several seconds, I simply listened. Standing there, fresh from hearing how uncertain my future had become, I realized something in my life was already gone. I just didn't know how much yet. By the time the laughter stopped, I was already backing out of the house. I didn't slam doors. I didn't march upstairs demanding answers. I didn't even wait to see who came down those stairs. Instead, I got back into my truck and drove. The steering wheel felt cold beneath my hands. My mind kept trying to process two separate disasters at the same time. One was sitting in a folder from the cancer center. The other had been laughing inside my home. I ended up at our lake cabin almost 2 hours later. The place sat empty beside the water, exactly as it had for years. Melissa and I had spent countless weekends there, fishing in the mornings, grilling on the deck, planning retirement. At least that was what I thought we were doing. That evening I sat alone on the porch watching darkness settle across the lake. For 26 years, Melissa had been the constant in my life. We met when we were both young and broke. Back then I was trying to build my first agricultural business from nothing. Long days, borrowed equipment, loans that kept me awake at night. Melissa stood beside me through all of it. Or at least I believed she had. Looking back, the changes hadn't happened overnight. About a year earlier, she started guarding her phone. Messages disappeared when I entered rooms. Calls ended abruptly. Whenever I asked simple questions, she had ready explanations. Work, friends, errands, appointments. Nothing dramatic enough to create an argument. Then came the spending. Designer handbags, jewelry, expensive clothing. Melissa began talking about people who owned luxury homes and drove imported cars. She'd mention them casually during dinner as if she admired something about their lives. At the time, I thought it was harmless conversation. Now those comments felt different. By midnight, I was sitting in front of my laptop. Years earlier, after a series of equipment thefts on one of my farms, I installed a backup security network connected to an independent server. Most people didn't know it existed, including Melissa. For several minutes, I stared at the login screen. Part of me still wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation waiting on the other side. But another part already knew better. The man laughing upstairs wasn't a repairman. And deep down, I suspected this story had started long before I walked through that front door. I typed in the password with 2 fingers and waited. The server opened slowly, folder by folder, each one marked by property name and date. I had built that system for theft, not betrayal. Back then, men were stealing diesel, copper wire, and tools from barns miles apart. I wanted quiet proof, something that didn't depend on memory or opinion. Now I was using it to look at my own house. I found the camera overlooking the front drive first. The black SUV had arrived at 1:14 p.m. Melissa opened the door before the man even reached the porch. That detail stayed with me. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't confused. She was expecting him. He stepped inside like he had been there before. Tall, clean shirt, expensive watch, the kind of confidence men wear when they think access has already been granted. I watched the silent footage for a long time. Then I switched to the interior hallway camera. There he was again, Derek Vaughn. I knew his face from town meetings and developer lunches. He owned several commercial lots near Lexington and had spent the last few years trying to buy farmland from families who didn't want to sell. Melissa had mentioned him before. Barely know him, she'd said once. Just business circles. On the screen, she touched his arm as they walked upstairs. I closed the laptop. Not because I needed more. Because I had enough. The cabin was silent except for the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Outside, the lake moved in the dark, soft against the dock posts. I sat there with my hands folded, breathing carefully. What surprised me wasn't that I felt pain. Of course I did. What surprised me was how quickly the pain organized itself into facts. 1:14 p.m. Black SUV. Derek Vaughn. Melissa opened the door. No hesitation. No mistake. No misunderstanding. For the first time all day, my mind became clear. The cancer had taken away the luxury of wasting time. Melissa had taken away the illusion that our marriage was still a place of truth. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew what I would not do. I would not beg. I would not explode. I would not warn them before I understood everything. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For years, my routine had been the same. Coffee at 5. Property reports by 6. Calls with managers before most people were out of bed. That morning, I followed the same schedule, but everything felt different. The world hadn't changed. I had. The diagnosis sat in a folder on the kitchen table beside me. The footage from the previous night sat on my laptop. Two separate realities. One telling me my future might be shorter than I expected. The other proving my past wasn't what I thought it had been. Melissa called around 8. I watched her name appear on my phone. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. Instead, I answered. "Morning," she said casually. The sound of her voice was almost unsettling. Calm. Familiar. As if yesterday had been completely ordinary. "Morning. Everything okay? I got home, and your truck was gone." I stared through the cabin window at the lake. Needed some time at the cabin. Without telling me, there was concern in her voice, but now I heard something else underneath it. Calculation. I had a long day. That part wasn't a lie. She paused. "You sound tired." "I am." Another pause. Then she changed the subject. She told me about errands she needed to run. A lunch appointment. Plans for the weekend. The same voice. The same routine. The same woman who had welcomed Derek Vaughn into our house less than 24 hours earlier. What struck me wasn't the dishonesty. It was the effortlessness. She wasn't struggling to maintain the lie. She was living inside it. When the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I opened a notebook. Over the years, I'd used similar notebooks for farm operations, equipment schedules, and property acquisitions. This one would serve a different purpose. I wrote the date at the top of the page. Below it, I listed everything I knew. Not assumptions. Not feelings. Facts. The time Derek arrived. The footage I reviewed. Melissa's statements. Her recent behavior. Every detail that could be verified. By noon, several pages were filled. The process felt strangely familiar. When crops fail, you don't panic. You gather information. When equipment breaks, you don't guess. You diagnose the problem. And for the first time since hearing those voices upstairs, I understood something clearly. My marriage wasn't a mystery anymore. It was an investigation. And I had finally stopped looking for reasons to ignore the evidence. Over the following week, I said almost nothing. That wasn't strategy at first. It was necessity. Between meetings with doctors, treatment discussions, and the reality of what was happening inside my own body, I didn't have the energy for emotional performances. Melissa interpreted my silence as distraction. She assumed I was buried in business matters. In a way, she was right. I simply wasn't focused on the business she thought. Each morning I left home as usual. Each evening I returned. We ate dinner together several times. We discussed weather, property maintenance, family plans, and routine obligations. If she noticed anything different about me, she never mentioned it. The more I observed, the more predictable she became. Tuesday afternoons. Thursday evenings. Occasional Saturday mornings. Patterns emerged where randomness had once appeared. Excuses repeated themselves. Names reappeared. Stories matched previous stories almost word for word. People often believe deception requires creativity. The truth is the opposite. Most liars recycle what works. I documented everything. Dates, times, locations, conversations. No accusations. No confrontations. Just records. One afternoon, while reviewing public business filings, I discovered something unexpected. Derek Vaughn's development company wasn't performing nearly as well as people believed. Several projects had stalled. Property loans had been refinanced. Two planned developments had quietly disappeared from local announcements. The deeper I looked, the more questions appeared. His image projected success. His paperwork suggested pressure. Financial pressure. That interested me. Not because it explained the affair, because it changed the nature of it. For months, Melissa had become increasingly fascinated with wealth. Luxury vehicles, exclusive neighborhoods, private clubs, people with status. Now she was involved with a man whose finances appeared far less secure than his reputation. The contradiction bothered me. Then another detail surfaced. Through county records, I learned Derek had recently attempted to acquire acreage bordering one of my largest agricultural properties. The offer had been rejected. Twice. I remembered the conversation immediately. One of my managers had mentioned it months earlier. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now it didn't. That evening I sat alone in my office after Melissa went to bed. The house was quiet. I stared at a collection of notes spread across my desk. An affair was painful, but affairs happen every day. What I was seeing felt different. Not necessarily worse, just more complicated. Because the further I followed the facts, the less this looked like a simple romance. And the more it looked like someone had become very interested in things far beyond my marriage. The following Monday, I met with an attorney. Not because I was ready to file for divorce, because too many pieces were beginning to connect. For nearly 3 decades, I had built everything with the assumption that Melissa and I were moving in the same direction. Properties, trusts, partnerships, succession plans. None of it had been structured around betrayal. Now every document deserved a second look. My attorney, Richard, had worked with my family for years. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't waste words. After listening quietly for almost an hour, he folded his hands and asked a simple question. What outcome are you preparing for? Not what outcome I wanted. What outcome I was preparing for. There was a difference. I don't know yet, I admitted. Then prepare for all of them. That became the theme of the next several days. Trust reviews, asset protection meetings, updates to estate documents, conversations with financial advisors. Everything was handled quietly, legally, methodically. No sudden changes that would attract attention. No emotional decisions. Just preparation. At the same time, my medical appointments continued. The contrast was strange. One day, I would be discussing treatment options and survival rates. The next, I would be reviewing property structures designed to last long after I was gone. For the first time in my life, I became intensely aware of time. Not calendar time. Personal time. The kind that cannot be replaced. Every hour spent worrying about Melissa felt wasted. Every hour spent securing my family's future felt valuable. The distinction became clearer with each passing day. Meanwhile, Derek's situation continued to reveal itself. Several investors had begun distancing themselves from projects connected to him. Construction timelines slipped. Funding negotiations stalled. Nothing catastrophic. Not yet, but enough to suggest instability beneath the surface. The image he projected publicly was beginning to crack. What fascinated me was how little either of them seemed to notice. Melissa remained focused on appearances. Derek continued presenting himself as successful. Both behaved as though perception mattered more than reality. I had spent my entire career learning the opposite. Reality always wins. Eventually, one evening, I sat alone on the porch of the lake cabin reviewing notes while the sun disappeared behind the trees. The cancer, the affair, the financial questions, the legal preparations. Individually, each issue was manageable. Together, they were reshaping my entire life. Oddly, I no longer felt angry. Anger required energy, and energy had become too valuable to waste. What replaced it was something quieter. Acceptance, not of what they had done, but of what needed to happen next. And for the first time, I realized that whatever future remained ahead of me, Melissa was no longer part of it. 3 weeks after my diagnosis, I asked Melissa to have dinner with me. Not at home, not at the lake cabin. At the same restaurant where we had celebrated anniversaries, birthdays, and business milestones for more than 20 years. She seemed surprised by the invitation. Maybe because I had become quieter. Maybe because I had stopped asking questions. Whatever the reason, she agreed immediately. Friday evening arrived warm and clear. The restaurant overlooked a small river just outside Lexington. White tablecloths, soft lighting, familiar staff. Melissa smiled when she sat down. For a moment, she looked exactly like the woman I married. That was the strange thing about Betrayal. The person remains physically recognizable long after everything else changes. We ordered dinner, made small talk, discussed family. She talked about future travel plans, retirement possibilities, projects she wanted us to pursue together. I listened without interrupting, without correcting, without reacting. Eventually she noticed. "You're awfully quiet tonight." I folded my napkin carefully. "There are some things I need to tell you." The smile faded. I reached into my jacket and removed a folder. Not the legal documents. Not yet. The medical reports. Her eyes followed the movement. "What is that?" "My diagnosis." The words landed harder than I expected. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. Then she opened the folder. I watched the color leave her face as she read. Cancer has a way of making every other conversation feel smaller. The restaurant seemed quieter, the air heavier. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "Why didn't you tell me?" I considered the question. "Because I was busy discovering who you really are." Instead, I answered honestly. I needed time. Melissa reached across the table. I didn't take her hand. The gesture hung there awkwardly before she slowly pulled it back. Then I removed a second envelope. This one thinner, heavier in meaning. She noticed immediately. "What is that?" I slid it across the table. She opened it. Inside were photographs, dates, records. Nothing dramatic, just facts. The first image showed Derek Vaughn's SUV. The second showed him entering our home. The third showed timestamps. Verification. Proof. Melissa stopped breathing for a moment. At least it looked that way. The silence stretched between us. Finally she whispered, "I can explain." "No," I said calmly. "You can describe it. That's different." For the first time all evening, she had no prepared response. And as I sat there watching the woman I had trusted for 26 years, I realized there was nothing left to discover. Only consequences waiting to arrive. Melissa stared at the photographs for a long time. The restaurant continued around us as though nothing unusual was happening. Servers carried plates. Glasses clinked. Conversations drifted through the room. At our table, 26 years of marriage was collapsing in complete silence. Finally, she lowered the documents. I made a mistake. It was the first honest sentence she had spoken all evening. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary," I replied. This required planning. Tears formed in her eyes. For years, that would have affected me. Not anymore. The diagnosis had changed something fundamental inside me. The affair had finished the process. I wasn't sitting across from my wife trying to save a marriage. I was sitting across from someone whose choices had already answered every important question. Melissa began talking. At first, the explanations came quickly. Loneliness, distance, misunderstandings, stress. The familiar language people use when trying to make betrayal sound accidental. Then the story shifted. Derek had promised things. Business opportunities, investments, connections, future security. The more she spoke, the clearer everything became. This hadn't started with love. It had started with dissatisfaction. The desire for more. More status. More excitement. More attention. Derek simply arrived carrying the right promises at the right time. What neither of them realized was how fragile those promises actually were. Within days of that dinner, events began moving without my involvement. One investor withdrew from a development project connected to Derek. Another demanded additional financial disclosures. Rumors started circulating through local business circles. Questions followed. Then more questions. Melissa called repeatedly. I answered very few of those calls. Not because I wanted to punish her. Because there was nothing left to discuss. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Regret. Explanation. Promises. None of them changed reality. At the same time, my attorneys continued updating documents. Trust structures were finalized. Beneficiary designations changed. Property succession plans were secured. Everything happened quietly, professionally, the way important decisions should. One afternoon, Richard called with an update. Derek's situation appears to be deteriorating. I wasn't surprised. Pressure reveals weaknesses. Always has. The surprising part was how quickly things were unraveling. Relationships built on deception rarely handle adversity well. By the end of the month, several people had begun distancing themselves from him entirely. Melissa included. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had risked everything for a future that was already falling apart. And as reports, rumors, and consequences continued spreading through circles I no longer cared about, I found myself paying less attention. The outcome didn't belong to me anymore. The choices had already been made. Now everyone involved would simply have to live with them. As summer moved toward autumn, my priorities changed completely. For months, I had been focused on discovering the truth. Now that I had it, the truth no longer required my attention. My health did. So did my family. The treatment schedule became part of daily life. Appointments, scans, consultations. Good days followed by difficult ones. Some mornings I felt almost normal. Others reminded me exactly why doctors spoke carefully about the future. What surprised me most was how much clarity illness creates. When people believe time is unlimited, they spend it carelessly. I had done the same. Arguments, worries, business disputes, small frustrations that seemed important in the moment. Now most of them looked insignificant. I began spending more time with my children, not because I was preparing to leave them, because I finally understood how valuable ordinary moments were. We had dinners together, visited properties that had been in the family for years, shared stories I should have told long ago. My grandchildren became my favorite distraction. They didn't care about legal documents, betrayals, or medical reports. They cared about fishing, ice cream, old tractors, sunsets. The simplicity felt like medicine. Meanwhile, the divorce moved forward quietly. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no public arguments, no attempts to destroy one another. Just paperwork, signatures, endings. Melissa reached out several times, sometimes through calls, sometimes through letters, occasionally through mutual friends. I read some of the messages, ignored others, not because I hated her. Hate requires attachment, and attachment had disappeared. The marriage was no longer an open wound. It was a closed chapter, something that existed in the past but no longer controlled the present. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch of the lake cabin, I found myself thinking about the day I heard laughter upstairs. At the time, it felt like the worst moment of my life. Now I wasn't so sure. Painful moments reveal realities that comfortable moments often hide. Without that discovery, I might have spent whatever time remained believing a story that no longer existed. The truth hurt, but it also freed me. Across the lake, sunlight reflected off the water in scattered patterns. The same view Melissa and I had shared for years. Yet somehow it looked different now. Not because the landscape had changed, because I had. Some truths arrive too late to save what was lost, but they arrive early enough to save what remains. And that was finally where my attention belonged. Today, I spend most evenings at the lake cabin. The doctors still give me timelines. The attorneys still send updates. Life continues moving forward, whether we're ready for it or not. Some nights I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sun disappear behind the trees. The water turns gold for a few minutes before darkness settles across the lake. Years ago, I thought success meant acquiring more land, expanding operations, and planning decades ahead. Now I see things differently. Time was always the most valuable asset I owned. I just didn't understand it until there was less of it. I can't change the diagnosis. I can't change Melissa's choices. I can't reclaim the years spent believing something that wasn't true. But I can choose what I do with the days that remain. My family knows I love them. My affairs are in order. My conscience is clear. And for the first time in a very long while, that is enough.